I want to ask you something before I begin tonight. If everything you have ever wanted already exists, not in some distant future, not in some other version of your life, but right now inside your own imagination, would that change how you are living? Most people hear that and nod, and then go home unchanged. But I knew a woman who did not nod. She demanded proof, and she got it at the greatest cost a person can pay. Her name is Louise, and I want to tell you what she discovered, not as a story, as the one truth that once seen cannot be unseen. She had been using imagination her entire life, and she had been using it successfully, more successfully than almost anyone I have ever known. She could name what she wanted, enter the state of its fulfillment, and bring it out as objective reality. Money, property, business, it worked every time. But she had been treating imagination as a tool, something she picked up and used and then put down, something that operated between her and what she wanted, a bridge she was always trying to build. And in 20 years of knowing me, of hearing me say night after night that all things exist in the human imagination, she had never quite grasped what that meant, not deeply enough to change how she lived. She grasped it on the morning her son passed away. And what she discovered in that moment is what I want to give you tonight. Her name is Louise. I met her here in this city 20 years ago. She was a model, beautiful, determined, and as poor as anyone I have ever known. She came to me once with a simple question. She had always wanted to go to Paris. She had just enough money for 1 week, tourist class, a modest room, nothing more. And she felt it was foolish to spend money she could barely afford on something so fleeting. I told her I was the wrong person to ask for rational advice. I told her, you want to go. Go. She went. On the second day in Paris, on a blind date, she met a man 23 years her senior. He was already married 5 times, but they fell in love. He divorced, married her, and over the years she came into a fortune. International businesses, factories across 3 continents, a life she could not have planned with the most careful reasoning in the world. She had built everything she had with one purpose in her mind: to leave it all to Larry, her eldest son, the image of his father. Every imaginal act she had ever performed, Larry was always the reason. For years, she applied imagination to everything, and it worked. She had the capacity, which I have rarely seen in anyone, to go into a state and bring it out as objective reality. She wanted something, she named it precisely, she imagined it fulfilled, and it came every time. She understood how to use imagination. She did not yet understand what imagination was. Her eldest son, Larry, was 18 years old. She had planned everything around him. He was the image of his father. She had sent him to college in London. One Saturday morning at 6:15, she woke with a jolt she could not explain. She sat up. She did not know why. She looked at the clock. Then came the call. It was the headmaster of the college in London. Larry had been in an automobile accident that morning, one of 5 in the car, the only one who did not come home. She asked when it happened. The headmaster said 11:15 London time. 5 hours ahead of New York, exactly 6:15, the moment she had woken. They flew to London, brought back the ashes, scattered them in Central Park. And then Louise, this woman of steel, this woman who could bring anything out of imagination into the world, went into shock. For 2 months, she was not present. Her husband wrote to me. He did not know whether to put her into an institution. She refused to be part of this world. She tried everything. Religion failed her. Philosophy failed her. She could not open a book. Not a single word from any tradition or teaching gave her any comfort. She said to me later, I had a pain that no doctor could help, no philosopher could help, no religious person could help. It was a physical pain. My body was racked with it. And she had only one thing left to hold. One sentence I had repeated to her for 20 years. All things exist in the human imagination. If that is true, then Larry exists there. And she was determined, with the same intensity she had brought to everything else in her life, to find him. 2 months after Larry died, on an early morning, she felt something moving within her. Surging, she said. Something surging from inside. And then out of her own being, out of her own imagination, Larry appeared. He was seated on the arm of the large chair in her bedroom. She was on the 33rd floor on Central Park South. She was alone. And there was Larry. She did not ask whether this was real. She did not stop to reason. She placed herself in the chair beside him. She brought her younger boy and seated him on the other side. The three of them were together. And she said she had never seen Larry so beautiful. His face was like velvet, and he communicated to her without words, not in sound, but in knowing, that he had not wanted to hurt her, that he had not wanted to cause her this pain. Then she asked the younger boy to go and bring his father from the living room. And the moment the boy rose from the chair to go, something broke within her. The vision faded, but something else had already happened. The pain was gone. The sense of loss was gone, not reduced. Gone. She said to me, at that moment, I was completely cured, and not once since that morning has it returned. She went out that day to walk and shop, and she looked at her husband reading the morning paper, and he appeared to her as a shadow, a talking shadow. She went out into the street, and every person she passed was a shadow, talking shadows. The whole vast world, the world she had once thought so solid, was nothing but a shadow. And she understood at last what I had been telling her for 20 years, not as a principle, as a fact she had now proved beyond all doubt. All things exist in the human imagination. The world without is the shadow. The world within is the only reality. I have told this story many times, and each time I tell it, I watch people receive it in two different ways. The first way, they hear it as a beautiful and moving account of a mother's grief and an unusual experience. They are touched by it, and then they go home, and nothing changes, because they have received the story as a story. The second way, they hear it and something shifts, not because the story moved them emotionally, but because they suddenly see, perhaps for the first time, what imagination actually is. And that seeing changes everything that follows. Here is what I want you to take from this tonight. Louise had been using imagination successfully for years before Larry died. She knew how to assume. She knew how to enter a state and remain in it. She had proven the law in the material world more thoroughly than almost anyone I have ever known. And yet she had still been treating imagination as a tool, something she applied to circumstances, something that operated from the outside in. She had not yet understood that imagination is not something you use. Imagination is the place where all things exist. Larry existed there not as a memory, not as a longing, as a reality. The world you are trying to change is a shadow. It always has been. It is produced by imagination the way a shadow follows a body. You cannot change a shadow by grasping at it. You change it only by changing the body itself. This is what I mean when I say, all that you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your own wonderful human imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. So when you sit down to do your imaginal work, do not think of imagination as something you are directing toward a circumstance. Do not think of it as a force aimed outward. Think of it as the only place that is real. and enter it the way Louise entered that room on that morning, not as someone performing an act, as someone who already knows that what they are entering is more real than the room they are sitting in. Conjure a scene which implies the fulfillment of what you desire. Enter it the way she entered that chair. Feel what she felt, not the hope of it, but the fact of it, not the longing, the reality. And then lose yourself in it completely, however briefly, and let it go. It will become real in the outer world, in a way you cannot arrange and do not need to understand, because that is how imagination works. Not as a tool that sends something outward, as the only reality. And everything you call the world is simply what imagination has already cast as its shadow. Louise proved this at the cost of the greatest pain a person can bear. I hope you will not need to pay that price to understand it. Take it seriously tonight. What you imagine is not a wish. It is not a request. It is a reality. The only question is whether you are willing to treat it as one. Now, let us go into the silence.